welcome back to the programme. Now, if you're just joining us, here are the latest updates following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the Ukrainian army are fighting Russian forces close to the Chernobyl nuclear waste facility. This would place the Russian army just over 100 kilometers from the capital, Kiev. Ukraine's ambassador to the US has called for Russia to be banned from the SWIFT international banking system. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia is defending itself. But Zelensky says Putin has begun a war with the entire free world.
Today, Russia started an invasion in Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a war with Ukraine and the entire democratic world. He wants to destroy our state, everything that we have built, everything we live for.
Meanwhile, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Vladimir Putin has made a huge mistake.
Putin is bringing suffering and destruction to his immediate neighbours, violating the sovereignty and borders of Ukraine. It is Putin's war. The purpose of the sanctions is to make the Russian government understand that they are paying a bitter price for this aggression. We will see that Putin has made a serious mistake with his war.
But first, Matthew Hollywood, our social media correspondent in the Cube, has been looking at how the invasion unfolded.
Well, Mariam, it began with a televised address from Russian President Vladimir Putin announcing that a military operation had begun. And soon after, Russian troops made their way across the border. This is a video that was shared online by the Ukrainian Border Guard Service. It shows Russian military vehicles making their way through the annexed Crimean Peninsula, across checkpoints and further through Ukrainian territory. Similar videos like this have also appeared across Ukraine. And at around 5 o'clock local time, citizens across the country were woken up to the signs of shelling in several major cities. As you can see from this map behind me, it appears to have been a three-pronged attack by Russia, from the north, from the east, and from the south. On Thursday morning, shelling was detected here in the southern city of Mariupol, the administrative centre of Donetsk region, one of the two rebel-held areas in Ukraine. Shelling also reported here in another port city in Odessa, where local officials said that at least 18 people had been killed. Now, while most of these Russian airstrikes appear to have been targeted on the east, as you can see, they also hit airports in the west, in cities such as Lutsk and Ivano-Frankivsk. Let me take you here to Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, and we can show you these pictures of the aftermath of shelling. Now, despite the fact that Russia's defense ministry said it was not targeting residential areas, this does appear to be an apartment building that has been hit, and local Ukrainian authorities said that at least one person has died in this incident after, in their words, fierce fighting. We also know that Ukraine have alleged that there were incursions from the north of the country, from Belarus, of course a Russian ally. And as you've just heard there, forces believed to be now around 100 kilometers away from the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Now, just near to Kiev, as you can see from this video, helicopters were going towards the Gokhamel military base. Really shocking scenes to see these Russian aircraft making their way over Ukrainian territory. Meanwhile, as we've seen in the city, many people have been stuck in traffic jams as they try to flee, several other people taking shelter in underground metro stations. In total, Ukraine says that so far at least 40 military personnel have been killed, alongside at least 10 civilians. Ukraine also says that it has shot down 6 Russian military aircraft. Moscow has denied those claims. Mariam, verified information from what is happening on the ground, as well as videos from the scene, is still difficult to ascertain. But I do want to show you this video that was recently uploaded by Ukrainian territory. And it does appear to back those claims that they have indeed shot down at least one Russian military aircraft. This video being uploaded and shared by Ukraine's defense forces. We heard from Russian President Vladimir Putin that he wanted to denazify Ukraine. But his words have also been taken by his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that what Russia has done to Ukraine on Thursday is nothing short than what Nazi Germany did during the Second World War.
OK, Matthew, thank you so much for that update. Thank you so much. Well, joining me now is Bruno Lette, who's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Mr. Lette, thank you so much for being on the programme tonight. Now, we've seen the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, labelling the invasion as the gravest act on European soil in decades. But do you think they saw this coming? And if so, why do they not act stronger? Do you think that these sanctions have been enough?
I think everyone had a sense of things coming, but perhaps no one wanted to believe it, that it would happen, because it did seem so irrational from a Western perspective. But indeed, these acts are now happening. And indeed, as you said, the President of the European Commission called it the darkest hour. So far, we saw strong condemnation from all European capitals. So clearly, it seemed that the war has caused a shockwave across European capitals. What people thought would not be possible is actually happening. And this indeed, comes to European capitals and Brussels as a shock, that's for sure.
Well, let's come to the idea of European democracy and Europe's standing in the world then, because in the days and weeks leading up to this, we saw the German Chancellor and the French President both go to Moscow. So do you think that Putin has essentially made them look a little bit foolish?
Look, I think what we need to realize is that, whether Putin will succeed in his objectives or will not succeed in his objectives, it is still an open question. One thing Putin did succeed to do, and it is to challenge the credibility of the West. I think we need to have a mea culpa among ourselves and realize that perhaps we failed as Western civilization to deter aggression and to uphold a liberal order that we ourselves had created in the 90s. So the rules of the game that we created ourselves are now being eroded in front of our eyes. And it is not just now that they are having been eroded.
Okay, we're going to have to sadly interrupt you there, because we are now going to go live to the UK House of Commons, where UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is speaking.
Earlier today, President Putin delivered another televised address and offered the absurd pretext that he sought the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. In fact, he is hurling the might of his military machine against a free and peaceful neighbour in breach of his own explicit pledge and every principle of civilized behaviour between states, spurning the best efforts of this country and our allies to avoid bloodshed. For this, Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands. And although the UK and our allies tried every avenue for diplomacy until the final hour, I'm driven to conclude that Putin was always determined to attack his neighbour, no matter what we did. Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest. I am proud that Britain did everything within our power to help Ukraine prepare for this onslaught, and we will do our utmost to offer more help as our brave friends defend their homeland. Our embassy took the precaution on 18th of February of relocating from Kiev to the city of Lviv in western Ukraine, where our ambassador Melinda Simmons continues to work with the Ukrainian authorities and to support British nationals. Now we have a clear mission: diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbarous venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. At the G7 meeting this afternoon, we agreed to work in unity to maximise the economic price that Putin will pay for his aggression. And this must include ending Europe's collective dependence on Russian oil and gas that has served to empower Putin for too long. So I welcomed, again, Chancellor Scholz's excellent decision to halt the certification of Nord Stream 2. Mr. Speaker, countries that together comprise about half the world economy, are now engaged in maximising pressure, economic pressure, on one that makes up a mere 2%. For our part today, the UK is announcing the largest and most severe package of economic sanctions that Russia has ever seen. With new financial measures, we're taking new powers to target Russian finance, in addition to the banks we've already sanctioned this week. Today, in concert with the United States, we are imposing a full asset freeze on VTB. More broadly, these powers will enable us totally to exclude Russian banks from the UK financial system, which is, of course, by far the largest in Europe, stopping them from accessing sterling and clearing payments through the UK. And with around half of Russia's trade currently in US dollars and sterling, I'm pleased to tell the House that the United States is taking similar measures. These powers will also enable us to ban Russian state and private companies from raising funds in the UK, banning dealing with their securities and making loans to them. We will limit the amount of money that Russian nationals will be able to deposit in their UK bank accounts, and sanctions will also be applied to Belarus for its role in the assault on Ukraine. Overall, we'll be imposing asset freezes on more than 100 new entities and individuals, on top of the hundreds that we've already announced. This includes all the major manufacturers that support Putin's war machine. Furthermore, we are also banning Aeroflot from the UK. Next, on top of these financial measures and in full concert with the United States and the EU, we will introduce new trade restrictions and stringent export controls similar to those that they in the US are implementing. We will bring forward new legislation to ban the export of all dual-use items to Russia, including a range of high-end and critical technological equipment and components in sectors including electronics, telecommunications, and aerospace. Legislation to implement this will be laid early next week. These trade sanctions will constrain Russia's military, industrial, and technological capabilities for years to come. We're bringing forward measures on unexplained wealth orders from the Economic Crime Bill to be introduced before the House rises for Easter. And we will set out further detail before Easter on the range of policies to be included in the full bill in the next session, including on reforms to Companies House and a register of overseas property ownership. We will set up a new dedicated kleptocracy cell in the National Crime Agency to target sanctions evasion and corrupt Russian assets hidden in the UK, and that means oligarchs in London will have nowhere to hide. And Mr. Speaker, I know that this House will have great interest in the potential of cutting Russia out from SWIFT. And I can confirm, as I've always said, that nothing is off the table. But for all these measures to be successful, it is vital that we have the unity of our partners, the unity in the G7 and other fora. And, Mr. Speaker, Russian investors are already delivering their verdict on the wisdom of Putin's actions. And so far today, Russian stocks are down by as much as 45%, wiping $250 billion from their value in the biggest one-day decline on record. Sberbank, Russia's biggest lender, is down by as much as 45%, and Gazprom down by as much as 39%, while the ruble has plummeted to record lows against the dollar. We will continue on a remorseless mission to squeeze Russia from the global economy piece by piece, day by day, and week by week. And we will, of course, use Britain's position in every international forum to condemn the onslaught against Ukraine, and we will counter the Kremlin's blizzard of lies and disinformation by telling the truth about Putin's war of choice and his war of aggression. And we will work with our allies on the urgent need to protect other European countries that are not members of NATO and who could become targets of Putin's playbook of subversion and aggression. And we will resist any creeping temptation to accept what Putin is doing today as a fait accompli. There can be no creeping normalization, not now, not in the months to come, not in the years ahead. We must strengthen NATO's defences still further. And so today I called for a meeting of NATO leaders, which will take place tomorrow, and I will be convening the countries that contribute to the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is led by the United Kingdom and comprises both NATO and non-NATO members. Last Saturday, I warned that this invasion would have global economic consequences, and this morning the oil price has risen strongly. The government will do everything possible to safeguard our own people from the repercussions for the cost of living. And of course, we stand ready to protect our country from any threats, including in cyberspace. Above all, the House will realise the hard and heavy truth that we now live in a continent where an expansionist power, deploying one of the world's most formidable military machines, is trying to redraw the map of Europe in blood and conquer an independent state by force of arms. And it's vital for the safety of every nation that Putin's squalid venture should ultimately fail and be seen to fail. However long it takes, that will be the steadfast and unflinching goal of the United Kingdom. I hope of every member of this House and every one of our great allies, certain that together we have the power and the will to defend the cause of peace and justice as we have always done. And I say to the people of Russia, again, whose president has just authorized an onslaught against a fellow Slavic people, I cannot believe that this horror is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status that these actions will bring to the Putin regime. And to our Ukrainian friends, in this moment of agony, I say that we are with you and we are on your side. Your right to choose your own destiny is a right that the United Kingdom and our allies will always defend. And in that spirit, I join you in saying Slava Ukraini, and I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In this dark hour, our thoughts, our solidarity and our resolve are with the Ukrainian people. Invading troops marched through their streets. Missiles shelled their cities.
OK, so that was the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking there in the House of Commons. Just to recap a little on what he did say. He said that Putin will stand condemned by the world and history. The allies have tried all avenues of diplomacy, but Putin is determined. We will see him as a blood-stained dictator. So strong words there from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He said that the UK will do all that they can for Ukraine as Ukraine defends itself. They said that there's a clear mission economically, politically and eventually militarily. He also talked about the virtual G7 summit. He said that we will match economic price Putin will pay and the reliance on Russian oil and gas has to stop. Well, now let's go back to Bruno Lette, Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund for analysis on what the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson said in the Commons there. Bruno, thanks for staying with us there. So we've heard from Boris Johnson there. He's talked about new UK, a range of new measures, oligarchs having nowhere to hide. Is this stronger now?
Sure. Well, we see actually a continued unity between the UK, the European Union and the United States. So all these measures are obviously coordinated. Clearly, the West is opting for a path of sanctions, harsh sanctions, sanctions that might cripple the Russian economy. However, sanctions are a tool They are not a policy to change behavior. Sanctions should be part of a larger policy. Sanctions rarely change behavior, and we've seen that so far sanctions have failed to change the behavior of Russia, of Vladimir Putin. We also should consider that sanctions only have a midterm or long-term effect. So they are not a short-term instrument. As right now people are dying in Ukraine, sanctions will not have an effect. So these are all things, of course, that we need to consider when we talk about sanctions. The duration of Western sanctions will also be critical, of course. How long will the West sustain this effort? We also need to envisage that Russia has likely prepared for these sanctions. It is well known that Russia has built a financial cushion through its national wealth fund. It has built a war chest to survive some time under a regime of sanctions. And we should, of course, also consider that Russia might be willing to retaliate against Western sanctions. So how much are we prepared in the West to also pay a cost for the sanctions that we will impose on Russia? That, of course, now is the key question.
But let's come to Boris Johnson's speech itself. Do you think it was a bold speech? He talked about it was a clear mission economically, politically, and eventually militarily. What do you think he means by that, militarily?
I think it's, of course, very important now to make bold statements because the situation is very grave. When we talk about military actions, it is unclear what that means. From a NATO perspective, it is clear that NATO, so far has not indicated any willingness to be actively militarily engaged. So far, we have also not received signals from London or from any other Western capital, frankly speaking, what military engagement may mean. There are also perceptions that the West would not want to be military engaged in Ukraine. There doesn't seem to be support among capitals so far for such move. But, rather than to think about boots on the ground, maybe what we could envisage is that there might be a military cyber response. Perhaps the West might engage in cyber attacks, harming Russian infrastructure that is critical to the country. That might be a military response as well. We don't necessarily need to think about land, sea, or air. There are other domains as well in this respect.
But do you think that Boris Johnson, in his language and what he was saying, he was very strong, but he was also, in part, a little bit non-committal? Especially when it comes to what potentially these further sanctions could be.
No, well, of course, we also need to envisage there's just that much that the West can do. If your policy is based on sanctions, this is, in the end, a fairly limited tool. Also, what Boris Johnson said is, it's all basically retaliating against Russia. What I didn't hear, for instance, in the speech is, what will the UK do, for instance, to help Ukraine directly? So, of course, we are helping Ukraine by retaliating against Russia. I don't deny that. But, what can we do directly for Ukraine as well? I haven't heard that, for instance. And this is, of course, a more difficult question to answer.
So what do you think that they should be doing for Ukraine, then, in your opinion?
To be frank, it seems that leaders want to limit their response to the sanctions, to the economic and political response. Even, for instance, so far the West was delivering weapons to Ukraine, capabilities to help the Ukrainians to defend themselves. Now such options seems more difficult to do. The Ukrainian airspace is also invaded, so it's not like you can just send an airplane to Ukraine with weapons to help the country. So that option is also quite limited in that respect. So I think that the only response we will see will be economically and politically, at least from a short-term perspective.
And just a final last question on Russia. Boris Johnson, of course, he did say that Russia is being squeezed. Is it going to have that effect on President Putin?
Well, there's no doubt the sanctions will hurt Russia. When we hear the amount of measures that are being taken, this will squeeze Russia. but again, not in an immediate effect. This effect will take a midterm, long-term perspective. For instance, I want to remind again that Russia's national wealth fund is now at a record high, estimated at $171 billion these days. So you can well imagine that Russia does have a financial cushion to absorb the shock of Western sanctions. That's why I want to underline again the importance of the duration of the sanctions, because even a national wealth fund doesn't survive forever. So in the mid to long term, I do believe, yes, Russia will be squeezed.
Yeah, and definitely sanctions and lengthy sanctions will definitely be important indeed. Bruno Lette, thank you so much for that analysis. Thank you so much. Well, we heard a few minutes ago from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He indicated that Britain could eventually support Ukraine militarily and repeated that Putin must not be allowed to succeed.
Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest. Now we have a clear mission, diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily. This hideous and barbarous venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Well, for more on the response from Boris Johnson, let's now go over to London, where Vincent McAvenny is live for us. So, Vincent, we really saw strong words there from Boris Johnson. Take us through again what he announced.
Boris Johnson was accused earlier in the week of being too light in the sanctions that he imposed, just 5 banks and 3 individuals. Well, he has gone much further than that, saying that there will be dozens of Russians here who will be facing sanctions, that there will be the support, as you've mentioned, given to the Ukrainians, even mentioning militarily. He'll be doing things like banning Aeroflot. There will be blocks in the UK's financial systems for Russian clearing as well. So it was a full raft of measures. There was obviously a liaison across the G7 earlier on in that meeting. We're about to get President Biden in a couple of minutes' time announcing similar sanctions to relieve what Boris Johnson just did. So this was to come back to his many critics in the past few days who say that he didn't go hard enough, and he said nothing is off the table. There have been calls to take Russia out of the SWIFT international banking system at the moment. That is still not being activated, but you can see that might be in the next package. But for Boris Johnson now, someone who only decided on Brexit on a 50-50 flip, this is the first big test of what he said during that campaign, during all the last few years, was the benefit in international terms of Brexit, of Britain standing on its own, of imposing its own sanctions, of going its own way in the world, but still being a part of Europe and standing with Europe. And so he is trying to put that message out to the EU partners that the UK stands with them when it comes to their response to the aggression from Russia in Ukraine, and that we will work with them because, of course, alongside France, we are the only other main nuclear army in the in Europe, and we boast some of the biggest capacities. Particularly, I think that's mention that he made of military force. I think the UK's cybersecurity has been something that's developed rapidly in the past decade, and I think that is what he was alluding to with that comment, that there might be both defensive moves for Ukraine with the UK's cyber force, but also some offensive moves perhaps against Russia.
Now, Vincent, let's take it back a bit from what you were saying there, and let's talk about SWIFT. With Boris Johnson saying nothing is off the table, but still not, of course, committing there. Why do you think the UK is still not committing to that?
Well, we know that Boris Johnson had a number of financial chiefs of bank heads into Downing Street last night to talk them through what could be going on, what they could do, how they can help. I think there'll be massive pressure on all those UK banks. If you see behind me just there, that is Canary Wharf. Sorry, I'll turn the other way. That is Canary Wharf, which is the main financial centre of the UK now. All of those banks will be poring over their books, poring over their client lists, trying to find out who the Russians are. They'll be reviewing all of the accounts that they have, the assets that they're holding here to see what it is that is on their books. And I think the problem that seems to be with SWIFT when you talk to banking experts is it might be a bit more complicated than simply, closing a door to Russia in a system. It's the system used by most of the world for banking. It's incredibly complex. And so there might need to be more time to figure out whether or not all of the effort to get Russia out of it will actually be effective.
Now, Vincent, there was a lot of course, criticism of the UK's first tranche, its first package of sanctions. With these new measures that Boris Johnson has just sort of outlined, do you think this increases the UK's standing?
Well, I think that is what Boris Johnson is hoping, but the criticism that's built up over the past 48 hours is that, well, the measures shouldn't be punitive, they should be preventative, that this is the package that should have been unveiled on Tuesday, and that this might have sent a stronger signal to Russia. But what is becoming increasingly clear today, and many people accept that, is Vladimir Putin has really turned a new leaf, and many people saying perhaps the isolation of the coronavirus pandemic hasn't been good for him. He's been isolated, and he has obviously decided at some point in this stage, in the past couple of months, that this is the path he's going to take. And it's unclear if any sanctions would have really deterred him. When you see the pace and the scale of the invasion he is now mounting on Ukraine, I don't think sanctions really beefed up earlier in the week would have stopped him from doing what he's done today.
OK, Vincent McAvaney, we'll have to leave it there. But of course, we will come back to you for further updates from the UK should they come. Thank you so much. OK, well, in Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been speaking. Let's now go to Kate Brady, who joins us now from Berlin. So, Kate, earlier today, we, of course, heard Olaf Scholz say that Moscow would pay a bitter price. What did he add in his address this evening? What can you tell us?
Well, in the evening, in this address to the nation, he really underlined that sense of solidarity with Ukraine, and also reaching out as well, sending Germany's solidarity to some of Ukraine's neighbours as well, particularly the Baltic states and also Poland, saying that Germany and other Western allies would stand united to make sure that their security is also ensured in the coming weeks. Of course, there are concerns there right now about what this invasion might mean for them as well, and what consequences that would have with them being so close to Ukraine. But he said as well that Putin will not win. That was a very clear message from Mr. Scholz this evening, warning that Putin should not underestimate the unity of NATO, and he vowed as well a future of freedom here in Europe.
Now, Kate, has this, though, taken Germany by surprise? I mean, Scholz, of course, wasn't long ago in Moscow.
This certainly has taken Germany by surprise, and that really was the feeling that you got in all of the political corners of Berlin today, but I think also among society as well. And one of the main reasons was a seeming naivety in politics, but also in society, about Germany's economic ties with Russia and what that meant for Germany's security and for the rest of Europe's security as well. And for a long time, Germany has adopted this strategy of what we call Wandel durch Handel here, this idea of change through trade. And that's a strategy that Germany's also tried to use to varying degrees of success with China in the past as well. And so there really seemed to be this sense, even in society, that these economic ties with Russia would be enough to always maintain any kind of stability and close ties with Russia. And clearly that is not the case. And don't forget, it's only just over a week ago that Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Moscow. He had the chance there to ask Putin face to face whether or not he intended on waging war on European soil, and he said no. And it's very clear that that is a real shock to the system here in Germany today, that not only Germany but the rest of Europe has clearly been lied to. As we heard from the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg earlier today, this is clearly a very long planned out attack.
Germany has been lied to, though, or that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, has been left looking a little bit stupid by Putin? How is it going down? How is the reaction to the fact that he, of course, was meeting with Putin not long ago, and now we're at where we are?
People are frustrated here in society. Of course, a lot of people were of the same opinion that this, as I mentioned, that these economic ties would be enough. But there is also frustration that it took such a long time, for example, for Germany to effectively pull the plug on that very controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. That was one of the sanctions imposed just earlier this week. That pipeline that's going to run, or is already built and finished, between Russia Certification of that has now temporarily been called off for the foreseeable future. But as you can see as well here behind me, some thousands of people, demonstrators, have turned out, as they have done over the last couple of evenings. The Brandenburg Gate as well has been illuminated in the colours of the Ukrainian flag by the city of Berlin in solidarity with Ukrainians. But many of them carrying posters and placards, which some of them have been carrying on a weekly basis now. These demonstrations aren't new for the past few Sundays, especially members of the Ukrainian community here in Berlin have been turning out, demanding more action from the German government and Germany's allies, begging Germany to step up. Many of them as well that I spoke to before Scholz headed to Moscow last week, demanding harsher sanctions already before the worst case scenario happened. And some of the people that I've even spoken to here just this evening said now they're demonstrating against the thing that was absolutely their worst nightmare just a week ago. And so it seems right now the feeling is too little, too late, and everyone's very concerned about exactly how Europe and how Western allies move forward from here.
So potentially too little, too late. So how strong a role then, Kate, can Germany now play? And of course, we do have this emergency summit in Brussels tonight. What role do you think Germany will play?
Well, at least what we've been hearing from with its Western allies, and that it's going to be a joint package of new, tighter, harsher sanctions. That's what we heard as well from Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock earlier today as well. But one huge debate that is certainly being rekindled here in Germany is the question of whether or not Germany would send defence weapons to Ukraine. That has been completely ruled out in recent weeks. But as we've seen in the last 24 hours or so, there's been a real shift in opinion, especially even from some very senior politicians here in Germany, some of them who were even previously seen as what's known here as Russlandversteher, so like understanders of Russia, and who would often take a more lenient stance towards Russia. One of them, the whip of the Social Democrats, don't forget that's also the party that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, belongs to. He described Vladimir Putin as a murderer. He previously was a staunch advocate of that controversial Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. So we're seeing a huge turnaround in attitude. There's members of the conservative CDU, CSU parties saying that Germany should step up and offer more support by means of defence weapons as well. And so that is likely to be, that's going to be debated this week, but there's also a special session, should I say, of Parliament in the Bundestag just around the corner from here on Sunday, where Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, is also going to be holding a speech. So certainly after that special session on Sunday, we'll have more of an idea about how Germany moves forward from here and what it plans to do, standing on its own 2 feet in support of Ukraine, but also with other allies.
OK, Kate Brady, thank you so much. And thank you for painting that very full picture for us from Berlin. Thank you so much. OK, well, to give us more context on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, we're now joined by Richard Sakwa, the Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent. Mr. Sakwa, thank you so much for joining us, taking the time to join us on the programme tonight. Would you say diplomacy has failed? Was the West perhaps short-sighted when it came to Putin?
It was short-sighted, and diplomacy was attempted. There were endless meetings. Scholz, Macron, everyone went off to Moscow. But in terms of diplomacy, one has to ask what actually was being offered. If you recall, back in December, Russia put forward 2 security treaty ideas. The response came on the 26th of January from the West, which basically refused to accept the substance of them. At the margins, there were some, the door was kept open a little bit. But in terms of the major concerns of Moscow, they were not addressed. And so we could say, and obviously it's awful what's happened, and I certainly don't endorse it, but it's the diplomacy never actually moved from the starting position. And that was the question of NATO enlargement, which isn't just a question for Putin. It was Yeltsin before that, and of course Gorbachev. So it's been a 30-year build-up to all of this, and people like me and others have been arguing for a long, long time that we needed some sort of overarching European security framework in which Russia was a genuine part of it. So it's no good simply saying this liberal order, democracy under attack and so on, and then you're talking about enlarging a military alliance, which Russia considered an existential threat. So therefore, when the diplomacy was going on, there was no actual offer on let's discuss NATO, let's discuss your concerns. They were not only not discussed, they were considered illegitimate. And instead of which we got an endless parade of bloc discipline, of saying the Allies are standing shoulder to shoulder. We needed more debate. We needed a rather more open discussion. And so, I'm not justifying again, but Moscow then felt, and it was unanimous, in the way things work, that the Russia's back was to the wall, and so we are where we are catastrophically. But this was predicted, and it was avoidable, and our diplomats have failed us.
So you really believe that Russia believes that its actions are then justified from years of being left in the darkness by the West?
Well, it believes that. I'm not to say that I'm justifying it, but I'm saying that it certainly believes that. And more than that, it's even worse. We've had 7 years of the Minsk Accords where those nearly 4 million people in the Donbass, that's important. We tend to forget this. But I've not heard an adequate Western reaction of condemnation. 80% of the mortar attacks and so on were on the citizens in the Donbass, in Donetsk, the city is on a borderline. It was shocking. Also, the suppression of Russian language media and so on for the last few years. So we had a virulently anti-Russian government in Kiev, which was then, even in the last couple of weeks, talking about becoming a nuclear power. This should have been slammed down immediately by our diplomats. And I was shocked to see that this discourse of a nuclear weapon-powered Ukraine next door to Russia, this is just so absurd. It's as if Moscow didn't exist. Its concerns were not important. Again, I do not justify the actions. It was wrong. But it was still, that's how we got to it. We have failed dramatically. Endless talk of sanctions and more sanctions and so on will not solve the issue either. It's going to be a long-term conflict, which actually will only encourage. And by the way, there's no question of Russia going beyond Ukraine. It was always that issue, the fundamental existential threat that it was perceived to be.
Right. So you really think that... So how far do you think Putin is then going to go? You say he's not going to go beyond Ukraine. So Europe shouldn't be worried, or Europe should be worried?
Well, we're all extremely concerned because once a military action starts, it's got a dynamic of its own. But, the idea of an attack on the Baltic republics or Poland or to go beyond Ukraine is just absurd. The West simply has failed to listen and understand the dynamics of Russian politics and Putin's concerns. If you remember his speech on the 21st, a few days ago, about the Donbass, he said, look, in year 2000, he asked Clinton, can Russia join NATO? It wouldn't have meant joining immediately. It would have been what people have been arguing for years. There has to be a pan-European, a continental security system, and indeed an economic system, some sort of genuine community, instead of which we had this endless talk of unity of the Euro-Atlantic allies, and we failed to develop a genuine pan-continental European security order in which those German understanders and so on could have thrived and developed. And of course, ultimately, Moscow would say, why has the United States been determining and trying to block Nord Stream 2 for the last, since it was first mooted in 2015? What's it got to do? It should be the Europeans deciding their own policy. So they felt excluded, and there was no point continuing diplomacy. I think they should have done. Of course, we should keep talking, but nevertheless, we have to understand how we got to this point, and that would perhaps give us a way to get out of it, which is to, obviously it would look like appeasement, but the word appeasement is meaningless as well. It means talking, it means concessions, it means understanding. We'll have to get there sooner or later, hopefully perhaps a bit sooner than later.
So what do you think happens if we don't get there sooner or later?
Yeah, well, the war continues.
What do Western allies then really have to do to, it would seem by what you're saying, to appease Putin or to make him feel happy?
Yeah. Well, maybe things have gone too far. It's not a question of appeasement. I detest this term, this constant talking, any concessions, it was appeasement, this obsession with 1938 in Munich. Putin complained, talking of Munich 15 years ago, he made exactly these same points. It was ignored. It was absolutely, and a promise was made the following year for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. NATO has been a neuralgic point for 20 years.
Let me just cut in there. You say he's been ignored, but does that mean he then should encroach upon Ukraine's sovereignty just because he's been ignored by the West?
Well, of course, it doesn't justify it, but it does explain it. And so Putin, there's a logic to it. And so one doesn't have to endorse the logic to understand the logic. And it is logical. And therefore, I think that the West has failed in its diplomatic response. And it's not surprising. We have this obsession with bloc discipline, this obsession with NATO standing together, the Western allies standing together, as if there's no chink in which outside views, that is Russia or even China today, can get in to understand. You can't just simply go about assuming that you are the source and the font of all that's good, and the Russians and the Chinese and so on, the font of all that's bad. This Manichaean Cold War worldview, which has got us into a second Cold War, and one which is potentially far worse than the first, because we lack statespeople. We have this obsession with unity and bloc discipline instead of people saying, no, look, let's listen, let's talk, let's move on. Scholz and Macron did go to Moscow. They offered nothing. So I don't think they stand, and I laud them for trying to do it, but they came and offered nothing. I mean, what did they offer? And I keep asking people, what concession, what understanding of Moscow have we had over the last few years? Again, not to justify the actions. And the answer is nothing. Over the decades, nothing, no space whatsoever, instead of which you have the remorseless advance of NATO to Russia's borders. And, the warnings were there endlessly, and they just weren't listened to. And the West is closed in on itself, and this is why we're in this catastrophic, appalling situation. And of course, Ukrainian people, Russians want peace. That's genuine.
Well, we can definitely agree on that this is a very catastrophic situation for all sides involved. Richard Sakwa, Professor of Russian and European Politics at the University of Kent, thank you so much for quite a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. OK, well, President Vladimir Putin has defended his decision to invade Ukraine. Speaking with Russian business leaders, he said Russia was left with no other option in order to protect itself. Take a look.
What is happening right now are forced measures. We were left with no other way to proceed.
OK, well, we will now go live back to Galina Polonskaya, who's joining us in Rostov-on-Don. Galina, thank you so much for being back, of course, with us on Russia's border with Ukraine. Tell us again, what is the atmosphere like where you are?
While here in Rostov-on-Don, life goes on as usual. The airports in the south are closed, 12 airports in the southern cities. And so the people seem not to worry so much about what is happening. But of course, everybody is watching the news. And on the state TV, the major news right now is this meeting of Vladimir Putin and the businessman. And as we've heard, he said that Russia did not have any other choice, just could not act differently, and he urged the businessmen to act, to understand, to show the understanding, to collaborate with the government. And he also underlined that Russia does not want to undermine the global economic system. And of course, he also said that Russia is prepared for all the consequences of the sanctions and has calculated all the risks.
Now, Galina, let's go back to what Putin said about Russia having no choice. What's your take on that?
Well, actually, Vladimir Putin said what he explained to the businessmen, that the risks for Russia were so high. The risks of as he had explained previously, of being a target of the NATO, and that's why Russia had to defend itself. That's actually the global message Vladimir Putin is trying to send to the Russians here, that what Russia is doing, it is helping the self-proclaimed republics, separatist republics, and by this it is defending itself and defending those people living there. And actually everybody who is watching the state TV says exactly the same things. I've been talking with many people on the streets today, and they are repeating the same things. They say that actually that they are happy that it is happening, and many said that Russia should have done it a long time ago.
Now, you mentioned people on the street. We're also learning, of course, that there have been protesters in Moscow who have been arrested. Tell us more about that, what they've been saying, and what they perhaps want.
Well, actually, there is a big protest in the center of Moscow going on right now. It's an anti-war action, but you have to understand that everybody who is out there risks real prison terms, because mass protests are prohibited in Russia. And according to an independent police monitor over the Info, at least 700 people were detained across Russia, not only in Moscow, because there were protesters going on the streets in the other cities, St. Petersburg, for example. So people are chanting no to war, and there was one man, for example, who just put the poster which said no to war up, and people started to applaud, and he was detained immediately. So this is happening right now in Moscow and in some other cities. And also 100 Russian journalists signed an open letter which correspondents of the Russian media, and they urge, this letter was signed by Echo of Moscow, Kommersant, TASS, RBK, and they say that there is no excuse to a war, and they urge this war to be stopped. And this letter was also signed by the Nobel Prize winner Dmitry Muratov, the editor-in-chief of the Novaya Gazeta. And also some stars start to speak out on Instagram, also saying that they feel so sorry for their friends in Ukraine, and that there is no excuse to war. So there are many people who support Vladimir Putin, frankly speaking, here, but there are also others who risk prison terms and go out on the streets and post those posts on Instagram saying that they don't want this happening.
OK, Glina Polonskaya, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you for updating us on those, especially those very brave actions by ordinary Russians. Thank you so much. Well, we will now take a short break, but do stay with us on Euronews Tonight.